Hello, everyone. So good to be here. Thank you for that introduction. First thing off the stage, I'm going to follow you on Twitter. I'm so sorry. I understand we're behind schedule, so I'm going to be talking at 1.5 speed through my entire lecture. So I think I just should dive right in. I'm going to talk to you today. Oh, these are my disclosures. I do receive some money for speaking fees and small royalties from my book. And I was a vegetarian for over 20 years, and now I follow a low-carb diet. It works for me, so that biases me for that diet, I think. I don't receive any support from industry, though. Okay, I want to talk to you about the dietary guidelines. Do these look familiar to you? Have people tried to follow the dietary guidelines? Raise your hand if you tried to follow the dietary guidelines and you think that's important. Yes. If you have advised anyone, or you yourself have eaten told more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, lean meats and low-fat dairy, avoid saturated fat, that is the dietary guidelines. We all follow them. Even though we don't go to a .gov website to find our dietary advice, that's what we follow. And we have all followed the dietary guidelines. I myself did, and here I am. At 20 pounds heavier than I am now, I used to wrap my fish in tin foil so that didn't have to put an ounce any kind of fat on it to cook it, and I would avoid red meat, and I didn't have butter for 20 years. What a tragedy! And I made my own 7-grain bread. And I exercised an hour every day, and I was not thin, and I had really bad hair, so I had to take this picture off because it's like I grew up in a little house on the prairie before the invention of the blow dryer, right? And this is not just us, and it's all of America. The best thing you can say about the guidelines, this is just a correlation, not causation, but you can say that they really have failed to combat obesity and diabetes. They really have not done a good job of that. And so why should we even care about the guidelines? This is a question that runs through this community. We are a bottom-up movement, people say, and we are going to change. We're going to change the markets. We're going to change what's on shelves. I'm interested in changing the guidelines and talking about the guidelines today, and I want to explain to you why it is still so important. Even if you've cured your own health and you've cured the health of the people around you and your family, it is still important to care about the guidelines. Here's why. The guidelines really affect so many aspects of our society, and they are like a straitjacket on many different areas. So let's just start on the left-hand side, USDA feeding assistant programs. Take, for instance, these are all the programs that 1 in 4 Americans eats one of these meals every month. So they really affect a lot of Americans. And the guidelines they either dictate or determine to various degrees what is in the foods of those programs. The Women and Infant Children program, called WIC. Those are the most vulnerable among us, the infants, right? What is in the WIC program? So this is unbelievable. You can get tons of juice, cereal, only these brands, including Frosted Mini Spoonies is one of their brands. You can get, I think this is per week. Actually, I'm not sure, but you can get 1 carton of eggs. What is missing from this? There's no meat, there's no poultry, there's no fish, there's no fresh fruits or vegetables, but there's no animal proteins. There's just no meat. There's no, especially no red meat. There used to be like a tiny tin of Spam or something, but they took that out several years ago. Okay, so that's WIC. Okay, what about our school lunches? Another big feeding program a lot of people depend on. That's the kind of thing you get in a school lunch. So you get milk, but it's only 1% or non-fat milk now, or you can have chocolate or strawberry milk because the milk tastes so terrible when it's skim, so you have to put some sugar in it to make it palatable, and whatever else that is on the plate. So those are our school lunches. What about the doctor, the advice that you get from a doctor? I think this is really important for this community especially. Because a lot of people are in individual practices, and so, and they've figured it out. They figured out what they want to teach their patients, and they don't feel hampered by the guidelines or what the American Medical Association says. But the guidelines are, that when you're in medical school, you get maybe 1 or 2 days of education in nutrition, and you are taught the guidelines. And this is a picture of a medical school class. Somebody recently contacted me. He said, I listened to the day of nutrition education in my medical school class, and the guy teaching it, he taught all the guidelines, and I went up to him afterwards and I said, really, do you not know about this literature about low carbohydrate being at least effective? Why not talk about it? And the presenter said, well, I myself am on a ketogenic diet, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. And that's because of the dietary guidelines, which are downloaded to the American Medical Association. That is the gold standard that everybody has to follow. And if you're in a large medical practice, and not a private practitioner, but if you work for, say, Kaiser or one of those big medical practices, you are not allowed to tell people about low-carb diets. And one of the doctors that I know tells me this is what she hands out to her people. She hands out the guidelines, and then she crosses out the part that she says she doesn't think works for them. So what about the military? The military, I mean, I know that was a very interesting report that Sarah showed, but the military food and their healthy eating programs follow the guidelines. We know we have a problem of obesity in the guideline, in the military, and there's a study to show that people in the military gain weight over the course of being in the military. These are people who are exercising every day, a lot of exercise. So, and this is what their healthy meal program shows you should eat. Green is, of course, what they use the stoplight system. Green is good. Egg beaters, egg whites, whole eggs, not so good. Definitely don't have the ham or the cheese. And all the vegetables are green. So this is what they're told to eat. And I know that I've been told there's a big red stoplight button in front of the meat saying this will deplete your energy, and a big green button in front of the pasta saying this is good fuel, good energy. So that's the guidelines. I want to say the other thing that they do is they do affect, every time you pick up a package of food and look at the food label on the back, and that's how a lot of people decide what to buy their foods. That all comes from the guidelines too. And cattle have been bred to be leaner, pork has been bred to be leaner. All those low-fat food products that David Ledvig showed earlier, those all come because the government asked companies to make low-fat foods. They literally put out a notice in the register saying, please, we need thousands and thousands of low-fat foods out there, and that's why we have them. So the guidelines are really important. That is the point of that. I think that I want to just go over, there's a sort of common myth out there about why, the guidelines work, they're fine, but the problem is people don't follow them, and Americans don't exercise enough. So I just want to briefly kind of debunk those myths. I mean, I thought this too when I started. I just thought, I don't try hard enough, I don't exercise enough, I'm just not diligent enough. And I really hated myself because, you just feel so badly that you try so hard, but you feel like you just somehow not trying hard enough. And Americans have been blamed, really, for their own conditions, which is really sad. But so as a journalist, I said, I'll look into this information and see if it's true. And this is what I found. If you look at the best available government data on American consumption, the blue lines are everything that we've been told to eat more of. And we do eat more of them. This is from 1970 to 2014. It's the best data that we have. This is on food availability, but you see the exact same thing when they adjust for loss, and you have a chart on this on consumption. Vegetables up 20%, fresh fruits up 35%, grains up 28%. Wow, we did a pretty good job. Vegetable oils up 87%. We'll talk more about that, but that's mainly soybean oil, not avocado oil. And all the red lines are the things we were told not to eat, and we eat less of that. Red meat down 28%, whole milk down 79%, and eggs are down, animal fats are down by 27%, butter's down. We have done a really good job. Why blame us? And this is just on meat, because we obsess so much about meat. Meat has stayed relatively stable in terms of consumption. It's red meat that's come way down. Beef has come down 34%, although maybe Sean Baker has single-handedly reversed that. And poultry is up by 110%. It's the chicken. We're eating tons of chicken. So, and this is also, I just broke it down in terms of plant foods and animal foods. We're told to eat more plant foods, the plant-based diet. That is where everybody is going in nutrition. This is to show we've been doing that. We've been doing a pretty good job. People complain about this chart and say, well, that includes sugar because sugar is a plant food. So here's the chart without sugar. And for some reason, it seems like, and the plant food, the curve goes up even more because actually we've been reducing sugar over the past 20 years. So we have been following the guidelines. If you break this down by macronutrients, you will see the same thing. Fat is down, carbs are up by 30% since 1970, and saturated fat is down by 19%, I think. So we have followed the guidelines. Stop blaming us. And I think it's absolutely true. There are people who do just eat junk food. There's no question about that. But there are many, that is not all of us. Many of us have really tried, like I tried. I made my own bread. I made my own pasta salads. I did everything right. And we still gained weight and got sick. On exercise, I think there's a lot of data to cite here, but this is just one recent report from the CDC that says Americans are exercising more. More than half of Americans in 2016 now meet the government's physical activity guidelines, which include both aerobic activity and weightlifting or some kind of intensive exercise that's not aerobic, versus 41% in 2005. So actually, we exercise more. We probably exercise way more than our grandparents or great-grandparents when there were no gyms. And plenty of office jobs. This has led increasingly to this idea that you just cannot exercise your way out of a bad diet, as I think people here in this room understand. But that really is the idea behind, those are the main reasons to explain why we have become so fat and sick. And the other one is, of course, that we eat more calories per day. We do. We eat maybe 270 more calories per day than we did in 1970 or 80. I forget the baseline date. But 98% of those calories are carbohydrates. So we eat more carbohydrates. So we don't know if the calories or the carbohydrates. I think if anybody just listened to David Ludwig's talk, I think you could say that carbohydrates clearly have some unique effect on the body that is more deleterious to your metabolism. So how did I get completely obsessed with the guidelines? I had written a book, and then this report came out a year after my book, and it's this scientific expert report for the dietary guidelines. And I went and I read, I hope nobody here will ever have to do this. I read all 472 pages. I read all the appendixes. I'm like, where's the science? I just spent nearly a decade of my life studying all the nutrition science that I could get my hands on, and none of it's in here. And that made me a little upset. So I wrote this article. Actually, I did a whole report on this that was sort of self-published and sits on a defunct website, but I'm happy to revive it. But out of that came this article. And I guess, like David just said, you're doing something right when people start to fight back on you. In fact, 180 scientists and researchers from around the world and their grad students signed a letter trying to get this paper retracted. And it was a whole year-long battle. And I'd be happy to tell you about it over several glasses of wine only. But ultimately, the paper survived they exacted corrections, but none of them affected any of the key allegations in the paper. And all the data that I'm going to present to you now is data that was never challenged. And this paper has now been peer-reviewed by pretty much everybody on the planet, as far as I know, but peer-reviewed formally twice. Okay, so this paper looks at what is the evidence base for the guidelines that affect so much, that dictate so much. Well, here are the 3 dietary guideline patterns, all right? So they recommend patterns of eating. There's the US style, which is basically DASH, Mediterranean, and vegetarian. Let's look at the data for the Mediterranean pattern, which is one that we think we all know. Well, the main paper on this Mediterranean was a paper out of Spain that was a long paper. It was retracted recently, and then it was allowed to republish on the same day, which is very unusual. And they said, well, we understand there were a lot of problems with it, but we fixed it all and we get the same results. Then just a couple weeks ago, there was this publication, which is a reanalysis of the Predimed by John Ioannidis. You've heard his name from Stanford. And he said, actually, there are still problems with this paper to make really its data questionable. So we're really not sure about the quality of the data of this trial. And as Richard Feynman has pointed out, there was only in this study ever a 0.2 absolute risk in terms of the primary outcome of cardiovascular events, 0.2 difference between the control group and the intervention group. Not very big. Okay, so, and that's the main evidence for the Mediterranean diet. What about US-style DASH? You know, DASH, American Heart Association diet, still #1 diet according to US World News Report. Every year it's on the cover, DASH. Okay, here's the evidence on DASH. This is the evidence that the guideline committee themselves cited. I have 2 slides on this, and I just want you to notice the length of the trials and the relative, the numbers are okay, 8-week trials. This is the second slide. This is the total quantity of data that they cited. 6 weeks for 30 days. That amounts to not a lot of data, and I'll have a slide on that that sort of sums that up. But 8 trials on 1,200 people in total, about no trial lasting longer than 8 weeks. The vegetarian diet. What's the evidence for that diet? In 2015 was the first time that they introduced a vegetarian diet. And we know that they wanted to find evidence for this diet because we did an analysis of the members of the Dietary Guideline Committee in 2015, and 11 out of 14 of them had come into this assignment of being on the committee clearly with they'd published literature and stated a bias for vegan, vegetarian diets. So we knew that they wanted a vegetarian diet on there, and they did get one on there, but what was the evidence? Nothing. They could find no randomized controlled clinical trial to support this dietary pattern. And they gave the quality of the evidence for this diet the lowest rank that could be given, which was the data was limited. So let's look at this a little bit differently now in terms of what was the data presented, how we were just shifting everything around to look at the disease outcome. Okay, looking at cardiovascular disease, what is the evidence for cardiovascular disease? What is the evidence that any of those dietary patterns can fight heart disease? They had the Predimed trial, which we know is now questionable, and the DASH trials. That's it. For obesity, can any of the dietary patterns help fight obesity? Meaning, can it help in meaningful weight loss, more than a pound or 2, right? What was the source of that? 1 2-year trial on 180 subjects with metabolic syndrome that after 2 years lost 6 pounds. How would that feel to people in the room here? 6 pounds, keep going, only 1 more year. Okay, so what about diabetes? Can any of the dietary patterns fight diabetes? 0. No clinical trials can actually fight diabetes. There are trials to show that you can, as Sarah said, you can just slow your path along that road, but there's nothing to show that you can do a U-turn. Then this is according to their data. So here we are, rigorous evidence for the USDA, HHS dietary patterns. Can you see it, anybody? Number of trials in each of those categories. This is the number of people in each of those categories, in those clinical trials, but we have to take away, that's the Predimed trial, so now we have about 1,500 people, maybe, tops. And this is the length of the trial. And again, the blue trial is the Predimed trial, I'll take that away. You're supposed to take that all away. But you get trials that are only 2 years long or shorter. For the dietary patterns. Now I want to compare that to the evidence for low carb. So the 2015 Dietary Guideline Committee did a review of low carbohydrate diets. And there was a conversation about it in their emails that we obtained through Freedom of Information Act request. And they said, wow, there's a lot of, one of the members said, there's a lot of data here. And another one said, well, we're going to put it in the methodology section. And the other member says, well, we certainly shouldn't be burying it there because it doesn't really belong there. And that was the end of that email conversation. But this is the data that was available at the time when they were writing their report. And this data is basically a database that was put together, and I published it in this My BMJ article. There were 74 trials on low carb at the time. The number of people in those trials was about 7,000 people. And again, got to take away PreDiMed. So, and here's the length of those trials. That's without PreDiMed. There were, at that time, 3 two-year trials. There were 32 trials 6 months or longer, and the rest of the trials were shorter than 6 months, of varying lengths. That shows you there is much more evidence for low carb than for any other dietary approach. I think it's very convincing. It's not to say that we should all say that we have enough information on low carb, but we certainly have more than anything else, any other diet. So by the standards of which we are giving people dietary recommendations at a policy level, low carb should certainly be one of those dietary patterns. And this is also, I think, a real critique of this idea that we really think the dietary guidelines is the gold standard. It is used as a gold standard around the world. It's referred to as the gold standard around the world. A dietitian who starts counseling people in low carb will get a letter from her association saying, you're counseling a dangerous, non-evidence-based diet that is not recommended by our dietary guidelines. So that gold standard thing really matters. If any of you have read my book or Gary's books or studied the nutrition literature, you're wondering, well, where are all the large studies that we know about? We know there have been big studies out there. Where were they? Well, for instance, there were these huge trials in the low-fat diet. The Women's Health Initiative on 49,000 people found out the low-fat diet had no effect for preventing any kind of nutrition-related disease. There were also these trials. These are NIH-funded, multi-center studies, very well conducted or conducted to the best of their ability, could find no benefit for the low-fat diet. These trials were not in any dietary guideline committee report ever since the beginning of the dietary guidelines. That was another finding from my BMJ article, which everybody loved, which was to say they had ignored the science. They had completely ignored that science. And it's why they've sort of tiptoed away from the low-fat diet. They do no longer say that they no longer formally recommend a low-fat diet, even though the diets they recommend in there, when they actually give out the formulas, it's a low-fat formula. But they no longer use the words low-fat to describe it because, as they themselves conclude, it increases the risk of heart disease. And the American Heart Association has also dropped their low-fat diet recommendation. If you go to their website and search the words low-fat, you cannot find them. And what about all the clinical trials on saturated fats? On 60,000 participants or more than 60,000 participants, and they found they could find none of them in many systematic reviews of the literature could they ever find any effect of saturated fats on cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular mortality, or total mortality. And I want to say these are all trials in which saturated fats are swapped for vegetable oils. There was some talk about vegetable oils yesterday and how they're almost like butter. But in these were trials where they actually looked at the different. They took out half the people had hamburger, regular meat, regular milk, regular cheese, and the other half had soy-filled milk, soy-filled cheese, soybean oil on their salads. And at the end of those trials, they could not find any difference in cardiovascular mortality for the most part. In some, there was an increase in cardiovascular mortality the more the men lowered their cholesterol. But what they did find was that the people on the vegetable oil diets died at much higher rates of cancer consistently. And that's a clinical trial. So you could say that those vegetable oils caused cancer, which is just one of the things that doesn't get talked about much when we talk about vegetable oils. That's the conclusion of that study. Okay, I have to race through the rest of my slides, I guess. So what is the evidence for the dietary patterns? It is all epidemiological. It all rests on epidemiology, and it is contradicted by the clinical trial evidence. That's an important thing. Daria Mozaffarian yesterday was saying that he really thinks it's important to look at the totality of the evidence, especially when it's consistent. In this case, it's not consistent. The clinical trial evidence does not support the epidemiological evidence, so what they did is they got rid of the clinical trial evidence and rely entirely on epidemiological evidence. That is kind of a no-no in terms of doing a formal systematic review. And I'm not going to go through the problems with epidemiology because there's no time, but you can get it all from John Ioannidis sometime. And it's really why I started this not-for-profit group called the Nutrition Coalition. And we are really, for our main goal is just to have evidence-based policy. We want these dietary guidelines to use proper systematic reviews of the science so they are based on the best and the most rigorous science. That's it. Wherever that science leads us, we will go. Thank you. And we're the only group in the world doing this now. We're the only group we are really in Washington talking to policymakers. They have never heard these arguments before, ever. You go in and you talk to congressmen, they're like, oh yeah, my granddad, especially from some places, he ate eggs and bacon every day and that was fine for him. I don't know what's going on with these guidelines. But we are introducing this to Washington for the first time. And we've had, what needs to change in the guidelines really quickly. They need to offer a low carbohydrate dietary pattern because the evidence supports it. They need to offer a meaningful diversity of diets because one size does not fit all. We all know that. They need to make the dietary guidelines nutritionally sufficient. They do not meet adequacy goals right now for potassium, vitamin D, vitamin E, and choline, largely because they limit the amount of animal foods that you can eat, and that's where you find those nutrients. They should stop recommending salt is lower is better because a great deal of data shows that it's really a J-shaped curve and that there's a moderate amount is best. And the best you can say is the science is unsettled on this issue, so stop telling people one side of the science only. And we were involved in getting this report out, which is the National Academy of Medicine, first ever peer review of the dietary guidelines. Yes. And mandated by the US Congress. They had $1 million in it. And their reviews basically said, lack of systematic rigor, do not conduct proper systematic reviews, needs to be redesigned in order to be trustworthy. So that's a strong report, and we are working with that report to try to get the dietary guidelines to be revised. And other things that we've accomplished, we've been able to get a low carbohydrate diet to be one of the questions that's going to be reviewed in the 2020 guidelines. That is awesome. And saturated fats, and that happened because people like you signed up for our newsletter, joined our coalition. People like you wrote in letters to USDA. More than half of the comments came from people in our community writing about low carb and saturated fat. And that was powerful. And it resulted in, it had a positive result. We got what we wanted. We didn't get what we wanted in terms of, we also asked people to write in for our evidence-based candidates who were to be on the Dietary Guideline Committee. We had thousands of people write letters to Sonny Perdue. I'm sure he loved that. But we did not get what we wanted with the Dietary Guideline Committee. We got some things. This woman has done research on the low-carb diet, Lydia Bazzano. This woman is researching how to increase protein to fight obesity. Those are there. You can see they're young and they do have new ideas and they know some of the new science. But this woman is a long time, twice a member of the Dietary Guideline Committee. This one has been on the Dietary Guide in 2010. She chaired it. At that time, she said, what we've been done now isn't working. To do nothing more for another 5 years. This is in 2010 now. That would be unconscionable. Well, that's still what we're doing. This guy is a Seventh-day Adventist. We have, who believe as a matter of religious faith that you should follow a vegetarian diet. If you want to read more about that, go to our website. We have a whole post about this, nutritioncoalition.us. So where do we stand now between despair and hope? And the 2 minutes I have left, desperately gesturing to me from Jeff over here. I think that this is our first step forward. We've accomplished a lot. We can no longer have this as our school lunch, our school breakfast program. We really, really need to keep fighting because it's so important. So maybe this means that we'll all need to do 1 million metabolically wounded march on Washington. Raise your hand if you'll be there. All right, great. That's awesome. So, and our goal is really just to say, in terms of having government policy, at least do no harm. At least do no harm. Roll out of the wrong recommendations. We're not activists. We just want to backtrack out of the wrong advice. So that's it. Thank you for your time, and I really appreciate the chance to talk to you.